Good morning.
Are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. I will yield the floor to Tom, who's my co-host. Tom, do you have some remarks that you'd like to share?
We are all very excited to be here with each and every one of you. And we are just been impressed over the whole week of the quality of our president-elects. And I know, like all of you, I'm personally very excited to hear Claudia present today on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can't wait to hear what she has to say. And I'll be here to assist her with anything that she needs. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Tom. And Tom, feel free to chime in whenever you need me to get back on track with things. So thank you for being a partner here today. And I would love to hear in chat where you're calling from. Give me your location in chat. Would love to hear it. And I am going to be very biased and play favorites here and say hello to Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Good to see you. So I have only about an hour with you today, and I have so much to say. So I'm going to get going here. But let me just tell you this. One, I am okay. I know I sound a little rough this morning, but I am COVID free. I am on the road to recovery. And this conversation is a conversation that has many layers to it. It's complex. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about our brains. We're talking about so many aspects that are in nature impossible to cover in 1 hour. So after 1 hour, I am hoping that the outcome is that you're curious enough to continue to learn about this topic that intersects with so many facets of our daily lives. So at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about some resources for you and how we can continue to stay in touch. I'm going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second. And Tom, can you see my screen? Great, thank you very much. For some reason, you can't see my screen, you let me know. So I'm Claudia Schabel, President and CEO of Schabel Solutions, and we have been doing this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion for over 15 years. In the last 4 years, I have been consulting with companies of diverse industries, diverse sizes, and also locations. And what we have found is that since last year, the summer of last year, because of George Floyd's death and also the upheaval around social justice and other issues related to the pandemic, this conversation has become even more important, more relevant, not only for for-profit organizations, but also nonprofit organizations. So we have been inundated with requests not only from Iowa, but also outside of Iowa, with the question, how do I start? And what is it that I need to do? And I always start with the business case. Here's why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so relevant for our organizations today. And this is what I want to cover with you today. It is really the business case. Often the we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion without really understanding the why. We jump right into the what. And today, the conversation is about the why. So, we're going to talk about the business case for inclusion, and we're going to discuss 3 actions that you can take. But before we get too serious here, I want to hear from you. There are 2 questions that I want you to answer in chat. In this case, you don't have to work with your partner. This is just for you. Question number 1, what was your favorite childhood food that you still remember? What was it? And it doesn't have to be nutritious food, by the way. If it was ice cream, it's allowed. And then the second question is, tell me how, where you grew up and how that environment shaped who you are today. I'll give you about 2 minutes for you to answer these 2 questions.
Only yes, yesterdays, every day
Good. I'm getting some answers here. Wonderful. Wonderful. Um, so I see your locations: Rockwell City, Pocahontas, Iowa, St. Louis Park, Minnesota, Rochester, Minnesota, Waterloo, Iowa, Mankato, St. Paul, West Liberty, Cedar Rapids, Des Moines, Davenport, yes, North Scott Country region of Iowa, North Davenport, okay, Southern Iowa. And then the food: chili, chocolate chip cookies, Swedish pancakes rolled in with cinnamon. Cookies, any cookies, pancakes, chocolate chip cookies, waffles, orange, grape, um, lamb chowder, uh, spaghetti, hamburgers. Oh, I, Tom, do you mind reading some of the food in chat for me, please?
I would love to. Um, Tuna fish sandwiches and with cashews in Rochester. Um, Sloppy Joes and potato chips in Wisconsin. All kinds of delicious things. Luckily, I had breakfast, so I'm not too hungry. Spaghetti with meatballs in
Oh,
Wisconsin,
yeah.
outside of Milwaukee. Corn on the cob in southern Minnesota. I bet that was fresh. Spaghetti again. Spaghetti is one of our top. Clam chowder, which is good during Lent. Chocolate chip cookies, pancakes, waffles. It seems like a lot of these favorites were favorites then are still favorites today.
That's great. And tell me now, how did this your upbringing was shaped by your environment? Tell me how that impacted you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Tom, do you mind reading for us what we see in chat about how the environment shaped those in this room today?
I would love to. It seems that there's a consensus, Claudia, that there wasn't much diversity in most of our crowd. A lot of them grew up in small towns in Iowa or Minnesota where they were 100% white. Not a lot of folks grew up on our call this morning in bigger cities, understanding diversity. Um, and they do feel that that has shaped them in certain ways. So I'm sure this is the perfect audience today to hear your message. A lot of minority, majority Catholic communities, um, yeah, but
Great,
not a lot of diversity.
great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Now let's define diversity. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about all of us. So when I look at this chat, I am seeing diversity. I'm seeing diversity of locations. I'm seeing diversity of so many dimensions that make us who we are. So I want to start there. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about all these things that you see on the screen right now. We start with the middle first, right? Which are the primary dimensions that make us who we are. It's, maybe our age, our ethnicity, our race and gender, even our sexuality. This is the core of who we identify as a person, as a member of our communities. But then the outer layer also help define our identities. And we, in some cases, are very attached to them. It could be our marital status, it could be our political ideology, it could be our work background. This is all diversity. Now, what I think happens is often when we say diversity, often we think about race and ethnicity. But in that case, if that's what we mean, we need to be more explicit and say we didn't have a lot racial or ethnic diversity, which is fine and is an important point to make. So last year, when we talked about diversity, often the focus was on race because of the racial inequalities that many of us were understanding, learning about, and talking about. But when we talk about diversity as a whole, we need to make room for more people at the table, and that includes all of you. So it is also important to talk about how those identities, when combined, can compound some of those inequities around us. And those inequities around us can impact women, can impact men, can impact other people very differently than they impact us personally. But in some cases, if you are a person of color, so let's say if you are a Latinx person and you are a woman and you are a single mom and you live in poverty, those inequities in our communities are even more exacerbated. So it is important to understand about those multiple identities that we carry, so we're not solely fixed on one aspect of who we are. So often when I introduce myself, I tell you, I am a woman, I am a Latinx, I was born in Brazil. Anyone from Brazil in here today? Anyone who has been to Brazil here today? I can see everyone. Tom, do we see any hands? You are on
I
mute,
do
Tom.
not see anyone from Brazil, but I'm
Okay.
scrolling through here.
Okay, no problem. I'm being a little biased here. Favoritism, right? You can call me out. Um, but I always, oh, Chris has his hand up. Yay. Chris,
Wonderful.
have you been to Brazil, Chris?
2 times.
Oh, very good. Great. Wonderful. So I grew up in Brazil. So when I identify myself, I am a Brazilian, I'm a Latinx, I'm an immigrant, and I'm the mother of a puppy. Those are all things that make me who I am. And I am telling you this and I'm emphasizing this because I want you to change the narrative around what diversity really means. Now, there are instances that our clubs will need to pay more attention to certain identities. I know the clubs in the past had to pay attention to gender. In the future, perhaps we have to pay more attention to socioeconomic status. Right now, we're paying more attention to race, and that all makes sense, but it doesn't mean we don't pay attention to other people. So let's talk about the business case. Now, disclosure. This is the business case for for-profit businesses. And there's a lot of the hard data tying to productivity, profitability, which we're going to talk about in a minute. With that said, every organization, it doesn't matter if you are a Rotary Club or if you are a nonprofit organization, I think some of this conversation applies. And I'll tell you more why I think so. But bear with me here because this data is truly focused on for-profit businesses. But the business case goes like this. First of all, it is important to understand that our demographics are changing. And in order for us to attract the talent we need to understand better this talent. But not only understanding this talent, leveraging this talent. Often I tell my clients that diversity for the sake of diversity is not good enough. You need to have diversity for the sake of leveraging the ideas, the diversity of thought, the influences, the perspectives that you have around the table. And unfortunately, not always we attain this level of inclusivity to truly leverage that talent. So beyond diversifying the clubs, the beyond diversifying our communities, we need to understand how do we diversify with the purpose of leveraging what they have to offer. We have seen that when we have racial ethnic diversity, it there is a linear correlation with innovation and group performance. And that innovation comes from different ways of thinking about a problem. It comes from different ways of fixing something. You know, being from Brazil, I know how sometimes I call my family members MacGyvers. You know, often they would try to fix plumbing issues and other issues without having to call a professional on their own. And if you think about it, that was pretty innovative. Now, there are other ways of addressing issues. And as you know, as Rotarians, as you have traveled the world, as you have met people from different cultures, you know that they bring those different perspectives to the table. And that's what happens when we see different teams Now, we also know that when we look at the marketplace today in 2021, it's very different from what it looked like 50 years ago. We are in a global economy, and it is important for customers, it is important for people that are being served by our organizations to see themselves reflected in who they're talking with, who's making decisions about the products that they are building or delivering, and then it goes a long way too in terms of anticipating what your customers really need. And last but not least, it improves financial performance. There are different data points here that I will cover with you that points exactly to this measure of correlation with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here is a research by McKinsey and Company that says that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability compared to companies in the fourth top quartile companies. And this data has been a work in progress over the years. In 2014, when McKinsey and Company started their first research and they continued to track, this trend continued to go up, up, and up from 15% to now 25%. So what we're saying here is that when you have leadership teams for Rotary or for your organizations, having the gender diversity it's important because, as you know, there are different approaches to how men and women and also non-binary people are solving problems. There is also a linear relationship between cultural and ethnic diversity and better financial performance. And companies with the most ethnically or culturally executive teams are 36% more likely to experience higher profits. And again, this is McKinsey and Company. And it went from 35% to 33%, and then now up to 36%. This is interestingly to see that how the numbers fluctuated, but it's still trending up. And then there's also the diversity that comes from your sexuality, meaning the LGBTQ plus community plays an important role in this conversation too. So 71% of LGBTQ plus individuals are, and 82% of allies say they're more likely to purchase a good or service from a company that supports LGBTQ plus equality. So, in other words, we know that purchasing power in the LGBTQ community is one of the things that many companies have been trying to target for many years. But this is also true for organizations that they are a member of or that they support. This community does a tremendous job in aligning their values with how they spend their money and they spend their time too. And also, more people now, allies, us who support our loved ones, we also are watching what are the organizations that are explicitly supporting LGBTQ plus individuals. And 72% of allies say they are more likely to accept a job at a company that is supportive of LGBTQ plus employees. And as I said, this is not only for a job, but also for everything else that they're doing with their free time. So overall, there is a correlation here showing that diversity is a competitive differentiator for organizations, for profit, nonprofit, that are really making this shift in mindset on how to incorporate these values in how they do their business on a daily basis. Now, the importance of having diverse perspectives speaks to this data point. A team with a member who shares a client's ethnicity is 152% more likely than another team to understand that client. And I think this is an example of speaking to those perspectives, those experiences. You know, I have been in the US for about 21 years. I feel that Iowa is my home. There are many things that if you ask me to explain in Portuguese, I can't. I can only explain in English because I learned those concepts in English. And but 4 years ago, when I was starting my business, and I had to select an accountant, I had many opportunities to look at a long list of accountants that in my area. I live in Des Moines, so there are terrific accountants around here. But interestingly, I decided to work with an accountant that specialized in working with immigrant business owners because something in me uh, pulled me towards her. And it's a her. It's a woman who is very talented because she has seen all different cases of immigrant business owners that had different circumstances. And I thought that she would be able to anticipate some of my needs even before I knew what my needs were. Was I right? I don't know, but I had comfort in knowing that she had that experience. And when I talked to her, she was extremely helpful. So this is important to understand. Now, if this has not convinced you that this is an important opportunity for your organization, or if it has not convinced you that this is an opportunity for your club, I want to share a little bit more about our demographics shift in the US. And this is US centric. By 2055, the US will no longer have a single racial ethnic majority. Millennials are the most racially diverse generation in American history. Of course, it's going to be surpassed by Gen Z, which is coming and entering the workforce right now. But 43% of millennial adults are non-white, which is the highest share of any generation to date. It will no longer be the case, as I mentioned, because Gen Z is right behind. But 43% are non-white. And that includes Iowa, that includes the Midwest, it includes our region. According to US Bureau of Labor Statistics, by 2025, millennials will make up 75% of the workforce. And when they are in the workforce, they want to join clubs like Rotary clubs. So 75% of them are going to be in jobs that potentially they could be wanting to join our clubs. Many millennials are foreign born, biracial, and LGBTQ, and they have defined diversity very differently from previous generations. And that goes also to what Gen Z is defining as diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, after 2020, I hope it's clear that Gen Z is a much more outspoken generation. They're demanding action much more quickly than any other generations that we have seen. And they do make selections about, again, organizations that they want to join, organizations that they want to work for based on some of those values. Any questions so far? Any comments? I want to make sure that you're jumping in with any comments. Any of Tell me if any of this has surprised you. Give me a one if it's yes, I'm surprised by some of the stats in chat, or give me a two. No, I already knew this information.
It seems that we have a combination of one and twos, Claudia,
Great,
with predominant on twos.
great, perfect. Thank you. Great, thank you. So again, when we talk about the workforce, when we're talking about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're thinking about all of those dimensions that we're bringing to the table. And sometimes we're going to have a balance, right? You can't always focus on everyone at the same time. But if you have a strategy, if you're able to prioritize, you can get there. And here's what's happening with organizations that don't always prioritize understanding their customers or the workforce. They make awful mistakes. My favorite mistake here on this picture is the bottom left, which is a Pringles with a smoky bacon for Ramadan. I know. It's tragic, very tragic. As a woman, I am also very fond of the Ford picture here because it seems like they are promoting this car to serial killers, and it doesn't always sit well with women. But again, when you're not aware of those cultural differences, which I know as Rotarians we are wired to pay attention to, but if you're not building this awareness into the mechanisms of how you uh, do your daily work or how you run your club, often we might mistakenly take some missteps like some of these organizations. Now, full disclaimer here, I don't think organizations are necessarily bad when they have a missteps like this. I just think it's unfortunate that they have not paid enough attention to avoid the missteps, and they need to do better. They need to do better. Now, we all know we have heard about unconscious bias before. I just want to quickly um, talk about unconscious bias because this plays a role in understanding the business case, but not necessarily articulating. As you know, we are wired to always have some of those preconceived notions, beliefs that shape our actions. So unconscious bias play a key role in not allowing us to always have the impact we want to have because those biases get in the way. So I often say that there is this gap between our good intentions and the impact we have. And if we don't mitigate our unconscious bias, unfortunately, we continue to make some of those missteps or continue not to leverage the workforce the way we want to. Now, I wanted to share this video, and many of you perhaps have shared this video before, have seen this video before, I meant. But this goes to speak about what we're still talking about when we talk about unconscious bias. It's that subtle messages that are coming to us, and we're interpreting those messages. Am I welcome here? Do I belong here? And I am just trying to bring to the surface some of the questions that maybe potential members of our clubs are asking. So here we go. And Dave, I am going to play a video. I hope it works on your end. So
All rise.
I don't know about you, but I like this video because it talks about, again, those subtle micro messages that we all receive in our communities. Now, this is the look about the color of his skin, talking about race. But I also like to share with people that I have the feeling that some of us have experienced some type of look in our lives, either because of our disability, either because of our age, because of our socioeconomic status, or you name it. So those micro messages, unfortunately, get in the way of our good intentions of being inclusive of all dimensions of other people. This is how bias is prevalent and very pervasive. Our company researches bias on a weekly basis, and often we find headlines that unfortunately get really good press for some of the missteps that they have been committed. And this biases go beyond just, as I mentioned, race. It's about age, it's about disabilities, it's about sexual orientation. Now, bias. The Center for Talent Innovation show that companies that experience bias, they experience less innovation, productivity, as well as higher costs associated with frequent turnover and burnout. So basically, individuals, employees, people that experience bias, and I would say too, people that experience bias in their clubs and their volunteer experiences, when they experience bias, it's much more likely that they're going to do the following. One, they're going to withhold ideas because they don't think it's important, they don't think it matters, or they're going to leave. And that's what's been happening with the workforce. Every year, 2 million people voluntarily leave their organizations due to perceived unfairness. And the interesting thing about this research by Center for Talent Innovation is that you don't even need to be the target of biases to perceive biases. You can perceive biases against other people, and that can impact you just as well, just as much, and make you want to not even be a part of the organization anymore. Now, biases impact productivity because there's a lot of cognitive power going into navigating the workplace when you have to avoid some people, when you have to avoid some situations, that all of that cognitive power is not going to actually doing your job. And there's always this potential burnout. If you are trying to make it work, if you're trying to overlook some of those instances of biased behaviors, it can take a toll on your health, on your mental health. And that's why sometimes the final decision is just to leave that environment altogether. Now, we have had situations, I think, in many organizations of all types that people leave for different reasons. But it's always a good practice to understand the experiences of the people that are leaving our organization. Are they leaving for a certain reason? Or are they leaving for those in, un, unseen reasons that sometimes we don't always talk about? Now, when talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations, there are three areas. And again, I think every organization, it doesn't really matter what kind of organization you are. I think you can relate with this three strategic areas, which is workforce, workplace, and marketplace. Now, we might argue that Rotary clubs are not hiring. Many of your clubs might not have the ability to hire, and that's fair. But a lot of times we work with our volunteers in the same capacity as if they were an employee, meaning they are doing the job. So we don't have the ability to hire, we don't have the ability to fire, but that engagement piece plays out in the same fashion, making sure that they're feeling value, making sure that they understand the policies, make sure that we have their voice reflected in how we're making some decisions. And then the marketplace, depending on the organization you're part of, but also our products as Rotarians. What is it? What is your product? How are you engaging your community? How are you listening to your community? How are you serving your community? And understanding also how your brand is articulated in your region? Are you seen as a club that is really strong with community service? Are you seen as a club that is always ready to help with funds? That reputation also goes a long way, and how you articulate your values goes a long way. Now, I know all of you have the support of many resources that have been made available to you. What is interesting, though, that even when we have materials that we can use, marketing materials or things that talking points, we still have human nature. So depending who you're delegating this task to, it's very possible that if that person is not aware of their the value of diversity or their own unconscious bias, that message might be skewed towards one group versus another. So when we talk about strategic approach, it is important to understand that every area of your organization needs to be looked at. So I know that you had a conversation about your strategic plan. I know you have an action step worksheet. So I'd like to take a few minutes right now to ask you a question. And the question is, I want us to have a roundtable discussion about how you can launch strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for your club. How do you see that working? And if you are stuck, I like to help you think through it. So we'll give you about maybe about 3 to 4 minutes. Tom, do you mind keeping track of that time for us? Um, and you can think. Now, let me ask a question. Do you prefer to do this work on your own and share in the gallery, or do you prefer to be paired with someone to do this work? It's a democratic process here. You can help decide. Paired. I'm hearing paired. Wonderful. Dave, do you think you can help us putting folks in breakout rooms?
I believe our
Absolutely.
technician could do that. Yep. Dave can.
Great. Dave, would you mind randomly pairing folks so they can have this discussion?
You bet.
Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing. And I'll put the question in chat so you can remember what the question is. Wonderful, great. I would love to hear from some of the groups. We might not get to all of you, but who has a burning desire to share? Is it you, Sarah? You want to go first?
Sure. So Jessica and I were in a group and I said this in the chat, and I think I may have upset some people, but we've done this before. We've been through these trainings, and so, and when you asked, one or two, if we'd heard this information, and so many people answered two, I feel like we are the same people over and over again in these trainings, and now we're being tuned out. And so how do we, at this point, it's almost, how do we even get our existing folks on board with even having these discussions? And then how do we bring diverse voices to the table and make them feel like their voices are being heard, and not just diversity for diversity's sake, because people know when they're a token. And so I think some of us have so much work to do. I live in a community that's 54% Hispanic, and we don't have a single Latinx person in Rotary. And it's we have two people of color in our club, and we've got the reputation of we're a bunch of old white men. And so how do we bring voices to the table without tokenizing them, and how do we get other people to even realize this conversation needs to happen?
Yes, great question, Sarah. I see some people nodding. That's perfect. So let me address that. There is a difference, Sarah, between having had these conversations, understand this information intellectually, but are actually internalizing it and being able to articulate it. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of people. People go through trainings, they learn the information, but then the first time that there is a little bit of resistance, it's so difficult to stand up and say, actually, this is why we're doing this. So for leaders, it's important to articulate this business case. It's important to internalize it, but also it is important to build mechanisms. So my challenge to all of you is, how do you put into action some of those values that we talked about here today? How do you make sure that you go back and look at how you're doing things today and change them? Because if we want different results, you actually need to change things. And I think, Sarah, for different clubs, different things need to be made different. But I will give you an example. I am the chair of membership for the club that I am a part of. And I have seen that there are things that I would love to do differently. It doesn't mean that everything I want to do, I'll be able to do, but I would love to experiment to see if we can have different results. Often people don't always agree how things need to be done, but having that conversation is the first step. So I think that this whole conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as you mentioned, Sarah, many of us have been having for decades. This is information that we know it's coming, specifically around the demographic shift that we have been seeing. So the question is, how ready are you to actually champion this work? And Sarah, where are you? Are you in Iowa or outside of Iowa?
I'm in Iowa,
You're in Iowa. Where in
in
Iowa?
what in West Liberty.
West Liberty. Yes, I now
Yep.
the makeup of your community makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think your specific challenge is? Are you the only one who is trying to make a difference in this space?
I think I feel like our club has been, oh, we wish that we could have more people from the Hispanic community in our club, but they don't want to do that. And that has been the conversation, I mean, since I joined 15 years ago. So it's very defeatist. And so there's not even really an effort. I feel like there may have been a stronger push a couple years ago. I wasn't in the club when this happened. And so there were maybe a couple of new members who joined, but they didn't stick around. But then again, I think that is also because our meeting structure is a little antiquated and kind of boring. So new people, young people specifically, have no interest in joining Rotary, because who wants to go sit and listen to a program about something? I mean, there are a lot of changes that need to be made, and I think that they will lend themselves towards making a more diverse membership. But recognizing that maybe it's not the fault of the Hispanic community, maybe it might be a little bit our fault that new people don't want to join. So we've got a lot of changes that I think need to be made. And
again, it's not changing your core values, it's not changing the essence of who you are as an organization, as a club, but it's changing how you execute upon those values, right? It's, again, that's what I'm calling mechanisms. I think you just recognized right now, antiquated way of meeting with members, even retaining members. So I think all of that needs to be looked through strategic lenses to understand, is this serving us well? I think that's the core question here. Is this serving us?
I think that change is a process. It doesn't happen as quickly as most of us want. And so we get impatient and we don't wait for that change to happen. But we have to understand that for that change to happen, people have to be educated about, we have to learn to understand what's different about the Hispanics, what's different about, people who work in this particular industry or this particular business. And, we just need to keep learning.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to comment.
Yes,
If
EJ.
you use the term Hispanic, there's what, 20 plus countries, and then you have people that are actually from Spain. Our speaker is, from Brazil, and I suspect a lot of people think that Spanish is the language in Brazil. We need to know a lot, and I think with Rotary, the fact that we're international really helps, and we have a lot of resources that other organizations don't. So I think we need to use those, and within our districts, if there's other clubs that have done better, at getting a more diverse membership, we should look to them. Our biggest diversity issue, I think, frankly, is age. And, I've been a member for a number of years. I didn't get that active on the board because it just was difficult with what I was doing. I'm retired now, but I think we just have to keep working at it. But we need to know more.
Yeah. Thank you, EJ. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Tina and EJ for sharing. Wonderful. Who else wants to jump in? We have a few more minutes that I'd like to hear. Josie, yes.
I think along with educating ourselves, I think that in moving forward and making change is adapting. And like Sarah mentioned, some of our meeting structures can become are antiquated. So a big question that I had in the breakout room was, what practices are we doing that are not, I don't know, not in line with wanting to bring in diversity and inclusion and having, new members, whether it's young members or members of different race or whatever it is. And a big one for us is, I think that we still do a Christian prayer. We start our meetings with an invocation, and we've had prospective members, or we've had people join who aren't coming to meetings, or we get, we have some members in our club that maybe aren't Christian or practicing and don't maybe participate in the prayer. And it was refreshing or nice to hear that there are clubs that have moved away from that. One of, I'm so sorry, I can't remember your name, but she said that their club hasn't done it for 10 years, but she had a wonderful idea, and that was doing an inspiration instead. The other person in my breakout said they do something from the Virtues Project. So it was really nice to get some different ideas.
Right, great, Josie.
Our
Thank
club, we've been fortunate in the past. We've been trying to work on greater diversity in our club, and we've got a full committee and all that. But through the years, what we really discovered for more women in our club, we kind of broke a barrier when they all of a sudden could have. There was enough members that were showing up at a meeting, they would have their own table. It just became that much more welcoming. And then the numbers really started to grow after that, which was fantastic. As far as race, we're working on it. We're really, really trying to work on it, but we've got a long ways to go, and we still have the issues. And Josie's point of the invocation, that's been kind of a hot spot, and we periodically get people upset when they use the J word or Jesus in the thing, so it's in the invocation. So we've got a long ways to go, but once you hit those certain numbers, like anything, it can really ramp up. So
Yeah.
I'm ever hopeful for our club.
Very good, Joe. Very good. Thank you. Anyone else?
I think the first thing that we need to do is take a look internal and look in the mirror, and both personally and then as a club. And I think, at first there are people that wanted to increase our racial diversity, which I wholeheartedly agree with, but I think we've got a lot of work to do on ourselves and as a club to really make people feel welcomed and to create an inclusive environment. And I've gotten pushback from people in my club because I don't believe that we have a really inclusive and welcoming atmosphere for new members particularly. And just because there's a greeter at the door shaking hands doesn't make the club welcoming and inclusive to all. And we have certain tables, even as president-elect, there are certain tables in my club that I will not sit at because I've sat at them before, and I know how I felt after that meeting. And there is, I think for us, the work is really on the inside, and I want our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to not just be siloed in one committee, but to permeate our entire club. So it's a new lens and through which we're making decisions about membership, where we're donating money, our service projects. I mean, the list goes on, that we need to make this part of our DNA in our club. And then I think the change in our membership will come from that, but we need to be there first.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, Jake. I think it starts with taking stock of what's happening today, understanding where you're at, understanding your vision, and then really strategizing every step along the way. Nothing happens by accident. It has to be intentional. And I think Jake, what you talked about, often when you look at those 3 areas that I showed you, the workforce, workplace, and marketplace, internal is workplace. For Rotary, looking internally at your practices, understanding what's happening, making sure those that are already with you are having the best experience they can have, is where you start. I know that we have a lot of emphasis on membership. As I mentioned, I am thinking about membership all the time. But if we think about bringing people to our house before we clean up the house, they might not stay very long. So it is important, like Jake mentioned, to take a very good look in the mirror and understand, what are we doing today? What's working? What could serve us well in carrying out this vision of inclusivity? And it has to permeate everything you do, every strategic step that you have put in place. Now, I want to be respectful of your time. My apologies, it's 9:30. Let me just share with you one more tidbit that I want you to carry away with you. And I shared this with my club before, and I want to share with you. So the call to action here is, how do you interrupt your unconscious bias? And I have shared with you in chat a link to additional resources, but I think it goes to the question, is it the truth, really? And before that, every action you do, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And is it the truth? What are you seeing and perceiving? Is that the only reality? And then become what I call triple A. It's an ally, it's an accomplice, it's an advocate. I think to Sarah's point, you might be a champion, but sometimes we need to be an accomplice. We need to be an advocate. We need to be the only voice in the room talking about why it's important. And it might not feel comfortable. It might not always feel safe, but it is part of this process. So the question is it fair to all concerned? And then using our privilege. And when I say privilege, I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I'm not saying you don't deserve what you have earned in your life. We have different types of privilege just because of our identities. So how do we influence systemically what's around us and challenge the status quo? And the question is, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Excuse me. Lastly, here are the resources that I want to share with you. And if there is anything I can do for you in questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, please let me know. I am excited to be working with the leadership team on diversity and equity actions for our district. So I'm looking forward to next steps. And for those of you that need to go, I know you need to jump off the call. That's perfect. But happy to stay a few more minutes if possible, to answer any questions you might have. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate you being here.